The rain came down in sheets that November morning, turning the asphalt of Highway 47 into a river of reflected light. Each droplet caught the pale dawn like fragments of broken glass, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Pennsylvania hills like the echo of old artillery fire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story doesn't
I
begin
hate
with
seeing
rain.
you like this.
It
Oh,
begins
don't you
with
worry
silence.
about me.
The kind
But
of
I do.
silence
I always
that
will.
settles
I
over
know.
a small town diner at 6 in the morning when the coffee is fresh and the world still holds its breath before the day begins.
It's great to
Margaret
see you
Flynn
all
sat
here.
in her wheelchair
You
by the
too,
corner
dear.
window
You've
of
all
the
been
Oak Ridge
wonderful.
Diner,
Wouldn't miss
her
it for the
weathered hands
world.
wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. At 75, she had learned that some warmth cannot be recaptured once it's lost. The steam had stopped rising 20 minutes ago, but she held the cup anyway because holding something was better than holding nothing at all. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, the kind a woman wears when vanity has been replaced by efficiency. But there was nothing weak about Margaret Flynn. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter sky, moved constantly across the diner's interior, cataloging every customer, every movement, every potential threat. Old habits from a lifetime married to a soldier. Habits that had kept her alive when the guardrail on Highway 47 had failed 3 years ago. The wheelchair was a prison she had learned to navigate. State-of-the-art titanium frame custom modifications that cost more than her first car. But no amount of engineering could give her back what she'd lost on that rainy night in 2022. The night she'd gone to visit the spot where Thomas had died. The night the same guardrail had failed again. Some people called it coincidence. Margaret called it murder. On the table before her lay a sketch pad, its pages filled with detailed drawings. Not art for art's sake, but evidence, measurements, angles, the precise point where steel should have held but hadn't. She'd been a nurse at the VA hospital for 30 years before retirement. She understood the human body, understood how it could be broken. These drawings were her attempt to understand how a system could be broken too. The television above the counter played the morning news on mute, President Biden addressing something or other. Margaret didn't pay attention. Washington was a different world, far removed from the problems of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Here, corruption wore a smaller face, more personal, more deadly. Frank Calloway emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of pancakes. At 68, the former Marine still moved with military precision, though his knees complained with every step. The purple scar running down his left forearm told the story of Quezon, 1968. The silver star tucked in a drawer at home told the rest. He set the plate in front of Margaret without asking if she wanted it. They'd had the same routine for 3 years now, every Saturday morning. Pancakes, black coffee, and silence that spoke louder than words. "You need to eat, Maggie," Frank said, his voice roughened by decades of cigarettes and the kind of regret that comes from surviving when others didn't. Margaret looked at the pancakes. Golden brown, perfect circles, steam rising from butter and melting into syrup. Thomas had loved pancakes. Made them every Sunday morning before church, always burned. The first one always pretended it was intentional. "I'm not hungry," she said. "You're never hungry. Eat anyway." She picked up the fork. Not because she wanted to, but because Frank had asked. Because in a world where so much had been taken, small kindnesses still mattered. She took one bite, chewed mechanically, swallowed without tasting. The bell above the diner's entrance chimed. Margaret's eyes flickered up, instant assessment. Male, early 60s, unfamiliar face, contractor's boots, caked with dried mud. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee, went back to scrolling his phone. Not a threat, not today. Margaret returned to her sketch pad. The drawing taking shape showed the cross-section of a highway guardrail. Standard W-beam design posts driven 6 feet into the ground, spacing calculated to withstand impact from a vehicle traveling at highway speeds. Except the posts on Highway 47 weren't 6 feet deep. They were 3. And the spacing wasn't regulation. Someone had cut corners. Someone had saved money. Someone had killed her husband. She knew who. The whole town knew who. But knowing and proving were different mountains to climb. Her hand moved across the page, adding detail. The graphite whispered against paper, a sound like secrets being told. She'd drawn this scene 100 times, maybe more. Each iteration searching for something she'd missed. Some detail that would make the case airtight. Some evidence that couldn't be dismissed or buried or explained away by lawyers who charged more per hour than most people in Millbrook made in a week. Beneath her chair, hidden in a specially designed compartment she'd installed herself, rested Thomas's old Colt 45. She'd taken it from the safe 6 months ago after the first threatening letter arrived. Had it clean, loaded, kept close. Not because she planned to use it, but because Thomas had always said that being prepared was half the battle. The weight of it, even unseen, gave her a strange comfort. The bell chimed again. This time, Margaret's entire body tensed. She didn't need to look up to know who had entered. The atmosphere in the diner changed the way air pressure drops before a storm. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they became quieter, more careful. Forks scraped against plates with increased caution. Declan Harrington stood in the doorway flanked by two friends whose names Margaret had never bothered to learn. At 28, Declan had the kind of looks that came from good genetics and better money. Expensive haircut designer jeans that cost more than Margaret's monthly mortgage. A jacket that probably had an Italian name she couldn't pronounce. His father's son in every way that mattered. The morning sun caught the gold Rolex on his wrist. $20,000 of privilege wrapped around the wrist of a man who had never worked an honest day in his life. Declan's eyes found Margaret immediately. They always did. There was history between them, the kind that couldn't be forgotten or forgiven. Last year, she'd published a letter in the local newspaper questioning the safety inspection of the New Miller Bridge. The same bridge where 16-year-old Anya Harrington, Declan's younger sister, had died when a support beam failed during her morning jog. The official report blamed structural fatigue. Margaret's investigations suggested negligent construction. Harrington construction, of course. Declan had never forgiven her for implying his father was responsible for his own daughter's death. Never mind that it was true. He crossed the diner with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences. His friends followed like remoras trailing a shark. They took the booth directly behind Margaret, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne mixed with stale beer and morning after regret. Well, well, Declan's voice carried across the quiet diner, pitched loud enough to ensure everyone heard. If it isn't Millbrook's favorite cripple. Still drawing your little pictures, Maggie. Margaret didn't turn around. She'd learned long ago that bullies fed on attention the way parasites fed on blood. Ignore them and sometimes they lost interest. Sometimes. I'm talking to you, old woman. Her pencil continued its path across the page. Steady, controlled. She was drawing Thomas now from memory. The way he'd looked in 1950 fresh off the troop ship from Korea. 20 years old and already carrying the weight of chosen reservoir in his eyes. She'd seen the photograph so many times she could recreate it perfectly. The slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The scar above his left eyebrow where Chinese shrapnel had kissed him. The purple heart pinned to his chest. Hey. A hand reached over her shoulder and slapped the sketch pad, sending her pencil skittering across the table. I said I'm talking to you. Margaret's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. Slowly, with the deliberate control of someone who had learned to master rage, she turned to face Declan Harrington. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. Drunk or hungover, probably both. His friends lurked behind him, grinning like hyenas watching a wounded animal. One of them held a phone recording. Everything was content now. Everything was entertainment. Good morning, Declan, Margaret said, her voice level as a surgeon's hand. I see you're drunk before breakfast again. Your father must be so proud. The flush in Declan's face deepened. My father owns this town, including this shithole diner. You'd do well to remember that. Your father, Margaret replied quietly, is a thief and a murderer, and you're living proof that cowardice runs in families. The diner had gone completely silent now. Even the television seemed to mute itself as if the universe was holding its breath to see what happened next. Declan's hand shot out and grabbed the handles of Margaret's wheelchair. What did you just say to me? I said your father is a killer. Margaret's voice never wavered. 5 people have died because of roads and bridges his company built. My husband was the first. Your sister Anya was the last. But you know that already, don't you? Because deep down you know exactly what kind of man your father is. She was guessing about Declan's knowledge, but the way his face changed, the flash of something beyond anger, beyond indignation, told her the guess had landed close to truth. Declan had suspected, maybe even known, but admitting it would mean facing what his family had become. You crazy old bitch, Declan snarled. He jerked the wheelchair backward hard enough that Margaret's head snapped back. My father is a respected businessman. Your drunk husband drove off the road because he couldn't see straight. That's not our fault, and Anya's death was an accident. The investigators said so. Margaret felt something cold settle into her chest. The same cold she'd felt in the emergency room when they'd told her Thomas was dead. When they'd showed her the toxicology report that claimed he'd had a blood alcohol level of 0.15. The report she knew was falsified because Thomas Flynn hadn't touched alcohol in 40 years. Not since Korea. Not since he'd seen what it did to good men in bad places. Thomas never drank, she said. Everyone in this town knows that. Everyone except the coroner your father paid off. And Anya deserved better than to die on a bridge your father built with substandard steel to save a few $1,000s. Declan's hand moved so fast Margaret barely saw it. He slapped the plate of pancakes, sending it crashing to the floor. Ceramic shattered. Syrup spread across the black and white tiles like amber blood. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Oops, Declan said. His smile was cruel, learned from his father, perfected through years of practice on people who couldn't fight back. Guess you won't be eating those. Frank moved from behind the counter with surprising speed for a man his age. That's enough, Declan. You need to leave. Now. Or what, old man, you gonna fight me? You can barely walk. From the other side of the diner, Lucas Turner stood up. At 32, the young waiter still carried himself like the Army Ranger he'd been until last year. Short hair, controlled movements, eyes that missed nothing. He crossed the room with the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly how much damage he could do if necessary. Sir, you need to leave, Lucas said quietly. This is your only warning. Declan sized him up, doing the math. Lucas was younger, harder, clearly trained. But Declan had his phone-wielding friends and the certainty that came from a lifetime of consequence-free actions. You must be new in town, Declan said. Let me educate you. My father is Mayor Nathaniel Harrington. This diner, this street, this whole goddamn town belongs to him. You're just renting space. Touch me, and you'll be unemployed by noon. Lucas didn't move. I don't work for your father. I work for Frank. And Frank asked you to leave. The standoff stretched. 5 seconds. 10. The kind of moment where violence became possible, then probable, then inevitable. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She reached into her bag, pulled out her sketchbook, and flipped to a page she'd completed weeks ago. The drawing showed a man in dress uniform, his chest covered in ribbons and medals. The face was weathered but proud, the eyes clear and strong. Beneath the portrait, she'd written in careful script, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." This is my husband, Margaret said, turning the book so Declan could see. Master Sergeant Thomas Flynn, Korean War, Purple Heart, Silver Star for Valor at Chosin Reservoir. He saved 17 men when Chinese forces had his unit surrounded, led a counterattack through enemy lines to open an escape route. 17 men came home because of him. She closed the book gently. He taught me that bullies like you are just cowards wearing masks of confidence. And he taught me that sometimes the best response is to stand your ground even when you can't actually stand at all. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Declan's face went through several colors, settling finally on a shade of red that suggested either embarrassment or rage or possibly both. You think I care about some dead war hero? My grandfather fought in wars too. Won medals, built this town. Your husband was just another. He never finished the sentence. The door of the Oak Ridge diner swung open and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. William Cooper stood in the doorway. At 73, Wildcat Cooper still carried the bearing of the Marine he'd been in Korea. Weathered face, iron gray beard, eyes that had seen men die and learned to live with it. He wore faded jeans, motorcycle boots that had walked through 3 wars and 40 years of American highways, and a leather vest that bore a patch few people in Millbrook had ever seen. The patch showed an eagle clutching a motorcycle chain, wings spread against an American flag. Above it, in worn gold thread, Iron Angels. Below, Korea 1950 to 53. Wildcat didn't say anything, didn't need to. He simply walked across the diner and placed a challenge coin on the table next to Margaret. Korean War veteran medallion brass worn smooth by decades of being carried in pockets passed between brothers who'd survived hell together. This is the widow of a hero son, Wildcat said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. Think carefully about your next move. Declan looked at the coin, looked at Wildcat. Something in the old man's eyes made him take a step back. For all his bravado, all his father's money and influence, Declan Harrington had never faced someone who genuinely didn't fear him. Whatever, Declan muttered, trying to salvage dignity from retreat. I don't have time for this anyway. He turned to leave, but not before deliberately bumping his shoulder into Wildcat's. The old Marine didn't move an inch. Might as well have shoulder-checked a fire hydrant. The contrast between Wildcat's composed dignity and Declan's childish aggression was stark enough that several diner patrons actually gasped. Lucas stepped forward. I think it's time for you to go. You just made an enemy. Declan pointed a finger at Lucas. Both of you. My father will hear about this. Good, Lucas replied. Tell him Lucas Turner sends his regards. Army Rangers 3rd Battalion served under Master Sergeant Flynn at Fort Benning. He'll remember the name. Declan and his friends backed toward the door, their swagger diminishing with each step. This isn't over. Declan called as they left. Not by a long shot. The bell jingled with finality as the door closed behind them. The diner slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed tentative at first, then with increased confidence. Frank began cleaning up the broken plate and scattered pancakes. But the tension didn't fully dissipate. Everyone knew that in a small town, nothing was ever really over. Wildcat pulled up a chair and sat down next to Margaret without invitation. Up close, she could see the scars. The one running from his left ear down his neck, courtesy of Chinese bayonet at Chosin. The puckered skin on his right hand, where frostbite had claimed 3 fingers. The 1,000-yard stare that never quite left the eyes of men who'd seen combat. "Thank you," Margaret said. "But that wasn't necessary. I can handle Declan Harrington." Wildcat's weathered face crinkled into something approximating the smile. "I don't doubt that for a second, ma'am. You have got Tommy's spirit. No question about that." He extended his scarred right hand. "William Cooper. Most folks calling me Wildcat, though that nickname's more ironic than accurate these days." Margaret shook his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip. "You knew, Thomas." It wasn't a question. She could see it in his eyes, the way they softened when he said her husband's name. Recognition of shared history, shared trauma. The brotherhood that only forms when men face death together and somehow come out the other side. Knew him, Wildcat's laugh was rough as sandpaper. "Tommy and I served together in Korea, Chosin Reservoir winter of 1950. Coldest I've ever been in my life, and I grew up in Minnesota." His eyes took on a distant look, seeing through decades to a frozen hell most people couldn't imagine. "Your husband saved our entire unit when Chinese forces had us surrounded, led a counterattack that opened an escape route. 17 men made it home because of him. I was one of them." Margaret stared at this man, this stranger who wasn't quite a stranger. This ghost from a past Thomas had rarely spoken about. Her husband had been a hero. She'd known, that abstractly known about the medals locked in the safe at home, the commendations framed in the study. But hearing it from someone who'd been there, who'd survived because of Thomas's courage, made it real in a way it had never been before. "He never talked about it," she said quietly. "About the war, about what he did." "The best ones never do," Wildcat replied. He gestured to Lucas, who was clearing the last of the broken dishes. "Frank, bring this lady a fresh plate of pancakes. On me." Frank nodded from across the diner. "Coming right up, Wildcat." Lucas finished cleaning and took a seat at the counter, positioning himself with a clear view of both entrances. Margaret noticed how he sat back to the wall exits, mapped hands-free. Military training didn't fade just because the uniform came off. "Thomas died when I was 72, Margaret told Wildcat. "Car accident on Highway 47. They said the road was wet, said he took the curve too fast." She paused, her hands tightening on the armrests of her wheelchair. 3 years later, I had my own accident. Same road, same guardrail, that failed." Wildcat's eyes sharpened. Same guardrail. Built by Harrington Construction. Inspected by inspectors on Nathaniel Harrington's payroll. Passed safety standards that it clearly didn't meet. She reached into her rig and pulled out a folder, the kind that lived in her purse and her nightmares. Inside were photographs, measurements, calculations. 3 years of obsessive investigation distilled into irrefutable documentation. The guardrail specifications called for steel posts every 6 feet driven to a depth that would withstand impact from a vehicle traveling at 60 miles per hour. The actual installation used posts every 10 feet driven half as deep as required. The steel itself was substandard grade C when the contract specified grade A. Wildcat took the folder, studying each page with the attention of a man who understood that details meant the difference between life and death. "You've been busy." "I've been thorough," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." Frank arrived with fresh pancakes, setting them down with a gentleness that belied his scarred hands. "Anything else you need, Maggie?" "Just the tooth," she said, "but that seems to be in short supply around here." After Frank left, Wildcat pulled out his wallet. It was old leather, cracked with age, shaped by years in back pockets and jacket linings. From it, he withdrew a photograph so worn the edges had gone soft as cloth. The image showed a group of men in leather jackets standing beside motorcycles. 1950s vintage big cruisers with chrome that caught the sun. In the center stood Thomas Flynn, younger than Margaret had ever seen him in pictures, his arm thrown around the shoulders of a much younger Wildcat Cooper. Both were grinning with the kind of joy that comes from being alive when you probably shouldn't be. "The Iron Angels," Wildcat explained, motorcycle club founded by Korean war vets who needed the brotherhood after coming home. Your husband was a founding member. 1954, right after we got back stateside. Margaret stared at the photo, unable to reconcile this image with the straight-laced man she'd married. Thomas had mentioned the motorcycle club once or twice, always in passing, always changing the subject when she asked for details. She'd assumed it was just another part of his past he preferred to keep locked away. "I never knew," she whispered. "After he met you, he didn't ride as much," Wildcat said. "Settled down, built a life, raised a son, but he never formally left the club." He tapped at the patch visible on Thomas's jacket in the photo. "Once an Iron Angel, always an Iron Angel. The brotherhood doesn't end just because you hang up your helmet." Lucas approached the table, having overheard parts of the conversation. "Master Sergeant Flynn," he said with genuine respect in his voice. "He was a legend. When I went through basic at Benning in 2015, the drill instructors still told stories about him, and toughest officer they'd ever served under, but also the fairest. He's the reason I made it through Ranger School." He smiled slightly at the memory. "Used to say pain is temporary, pride is forever." Got me through more than one impossible march. Margaret felt overwhelmed by these connections to her husband that had suddenly appeared like ghosts from a past she'd never fully known. For 3 years after Thomas's death, it had been just her keeping his memory alive through photographs and fading recollections. Now suddenly here were people who had known him in ways she never had. Known him as the soldier, the biker, the hero. Not just the man who made burned pancakes on Sunday mornings and fell asleep during the evening news. "He would be proud of you," Lucas said, noticing her expression. Standing up to Declan like that took real courage, the kind that can't be taught. The moment was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming outside. Through the window, Margaret could see Declan returning with reinforcements. 2 much larger friends built like linebackers' muscles that came from steroids and gym memberships paid for by Daddy's money. "Looks like trouble's back," Lucas muttered, his posture shifting subtly. "Ready." Frank reached for the phone behind the counter. "I'll call the police." "Don't bother," Wildcat said, his eyes still on the approaching men. "Sheriff Morris is on Harrington's payroll. They'll take 30 minutes to respond, and then they'll do nothing. I've seen this dance before." The bell jangled as Declan pushed through the door, his reinforcements flanking him like hired muscle. His hair was still damp from some attempt to clean up, and his eyes burned with the kind of rage that comes from humiliation in front of an audience. "You think that was funny?" Declan demanded, striding toward Margaret's table. "Nobody makes a fool out of me in public. Nobody." Lucas moved to intercept. One of Declan's friends stepped in front of him. The size difference was considerable. The football player towered over Lucas's compact frame by at least 6 inches and 80 pounds of artificially enhanced muscle. Wildcat remained seated, seemingly unconcerned by the escalating situation. He'd faced Chinese infantry in sub-zero temperatures. 3 spoiled rich kids didn't register as a threat. "Son, you've already made a fool of yourself," Wildcat said calmly. "No help needed from anyone else." Declan ignored him, focusing on Margaret. "You're going to apologize right now, or my friends here are going to take that fancy wheelchair of yours for a ride. Without you in it." Margaret felt fear curl in her stomach, cold and familiar. But she refused to show it. Her right hand drifted subtly toward the hidden compartment under her chair. Not to draw the weapon, just to know it was there. "I'm not apologizing for defending myself against a bully." "Wrong answer," Declan snarled, nodding to one of his friends. The big man moved toward Margaret's wheelchair. The kitchen door swung open with enough force to bang against the wall. Frank emerged carrying a heavy cast-iron skillet, still steaming from the griddle grease popping on its surface. "Touch her and you'll be eating through a straw for the next 6 months." "And that's a promise, not a threat." The football player hesitated, looking to Declan for guidance. The other customers in the diner had gone silent again, some leaving money on their tables and quietly exiting, others watching with morbid fascination. A few pulled out phones recording. In the age of social media, everything was content. Everything was potential viral gold. Wildcat slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Declan, did your father ever tell you about a group called the Iron Angels?" Declan frowned, momentarily distracted. "What, the Iron Angels?" Wildcat repeated. "Motorcycle club founded after the Korean War. Your father knows us well." He cocked his head slightly. "Very well indeed. We have history." Before Declan could respond, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines became audible. The sound grew steadily louder, like approaching thunder on a clear day. Deep, throaty roars that spoke of big engines and bigger history. Wildcat's smile transformed his weathered face into something almost predatory. Perfect timing. Outside, the first of the motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot. Not just any motorcycles, but vintage Harley-Davidsons, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun like polished steel sabers. One after another, they arrived, forming a perfect line across the front of the diner like cavalry preparing for a charge. Margaret counted 15 riders, all men in their 60s or older, each wearing a leather jacket emblazoned with the same patch she'd seen in the photograph of Thomas. The Iron Angels had arrived, and they looked like they meant business. Leading them was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair, cut military short. His beard was neatly trimmed, and despite his age somewhere north of 70, he moved with the fluid confidence of someone half his years. A scar ran down the right side of his face from temple to jaw, the kind of wound that should have killed but didn't. He swung off his motorcycle with practiced ease and stood for a moment surveying the scene through the diner's windows with the tactical assessment of a career soldier. "That's Colonel Jack Thompson," Wildcat explained to Margaret in a low voice. "Korean War Special Forces, later served in classified operations that never made the news. He's been leading the Iron Angels since your husband stepped down in '92. The colonel entered the diner followed by two other riders. He surveyed the room with eyes that had seen combat on 3 continents and learned to read threats the way other men read newspapers. His gaze landed briefly on Declan and his muscle-bound friends before finding Margaret. "William," he nodded to Wildcat. "This the situation you called about?" Wildcat gestured to Margaret. "Colonel, meet Margaret Flynn, Tommy's widow." The colonel's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. He approached Margaret's table and extended his hand. The grip was firm, calloused from decades of motorcycle riding and military service. "Your husband was one of the finest men I ever knew, ma'am. It's an honor to finally meet you, Mrs. Flynn. Tommy spoke of you often." Margaret shook his hand, feeling the strength still in those weathered fingers. "Thank you, sir." Colonel Thompson turned to face Declan, who had backed up slightly, his bravado diminishing in the face of 15 veteran bikers who looked like they'd forgotten more about violence than he'd ever learned. "And you must be Harrington's boy." Declan tried to stand taller. "My father is the mayor of this town." "I'm well aware of who your father is," the colonel replied, his voice level but carrying an undercurrent of steel tempered in fires Declan couldn't imagine. "Nathaniel Harrington and I have history. He probably hasn't mentioned me." The colonel took a step closer to Declan. Despite his age, he was still an imposing figure, shoulders broadened by decades of physical labor and military service. "I understand you've been causing problems for Mrs. Flynn here." That true, Declan glanced nervously at his friends, who seemed less eager to intervene now that the odds had shifted dramatically. "This is none of your business, old man. This is between me and the crazy lady." A ripple of tension passed through the assembled veterans. Several took steps forward, but the colonel raised a hand, stopping them with a gesture that spoke of absolute authority. "You know, son," he said conversationally, "one of the first things they teach you in the military is how to read a situation. Terrain, numbers, morale. Right now, you're outnumbered, outflanked, and facing men who've survived far worse than anything you could imagine." He smiled without warmth. "But more importantly, you're on the wrong side of right. And that's something your father should have taught you to avoid, if he'd stayed in the military long enough to learn it himself." Declan's face flushed with anger. "Don't talk about my father. You don't know anything about him." "I know Nathaniel Harrington was disciplined for conduct unbecoming an officer during his brief military career," the colonel replied. "I know he received a dishonorable discharge after less than a year of service for falsifying supply records and black market activities. And I know he's been lying about his military record ever since building his political career on stolen valor. Tells people he served in Korea. He was stateside the whole time, stealing from his own unit." The color drained from Declan's face. Around the diner, people leaned forward. This was news. This was the kind of small-town scandal that would dominate conversations for months. "You're lying," Declan said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing, even to his own ears. Margaret watched this exchange with growing understanding. She remembered overhearing conversations years ago, Thomas's voice uncharacteristically angry as he spoke about that opportunist Nate Harrington. Now the pieces were falling into place. Now the puzzle was revealing its true picture. Unable to help herself, Margaret reached for her sketchbook and began drawing rapidly, capturing the confrontation unfolding before her. Her pencil moved across the page with practiced precision, outlining the colonel's commanding presence facing off against Declan's faltering confidence. This was history. This was truth being spoken to power. This needed to be documented. Declan noticed her drawing and lunged forward, grabbing for the sketchbook. "Stop drawing me, you crippled!" His movement was so sudden that no one had time to intervene. But before he could reach Margaret, the colonel's hand shot out, grasping Declan's wrist with surprising strength. The grip of a man who'd survived hand-to-hand combat in frozen Korean hills, who'd learned to kill with his bare hands and never quite forgotten how. "That was a mistake, son," the colonel said quietly, his voice carrying more threat in its calmness than shouting ever could. Declan tried to pull free, but the older man's grip was like iron. One of Declan's friends moved to help, but found his path blocked by two iron angels who had silently positioned themselves in the way. Big men, old men, men who'd forgotten more about fighting than Declan's steroid-enhanced friend would ever learn. "Let go of me," Declan demanded, his voice rising with panic. "When you apologize to the lady," the colonel replied calmly. "Properly." Declan struggled for another moment before realizing the futility of resistance. "Fine, I'm sorry. Okay, now let go." "Not good enough," the colonel said. "Try again, with respect." Declan's face cycled through anger, fear, and finally something resembling shame. "I apologize, Mrs. Flynn, for my behavior. It was wrong." The colonel released him, and Declan stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist. His two friends looked to him uncertainly, the script having diverged significantly from what they'd expected. "Let's get out of here," one of them muttered. "This isn't worth it, man." Declan looked around at the assembled veterans, at Margaret calmly continuing her drawing, at Lucas and Frank standing ready to defend her. For the first time in his privileged life, uncertainty flickered across his features. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. As Declan and his friends retreated toward the door, it swung open once more. A man in an expensive suit stood framed in the doorway, his silver hair and confident posture marking him immediately as someone accustomed to authority. Mayor Nathaniel Harrington had arrived, and the real confrontation was about to begin. Nathaniel Harrington stood in the doorway of the Oak Ridge Diner like a man surveying property he owned. At 58, the mayor of Millbrook carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent 3 decades building power, one compromise at a time. His suit was tailored, his shoes Italian leather, his smile practiced in 1,000 mirrors and 10,000 public appearances. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who viewed people as assets or obstacles, nothing in between. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the false concern of a politician addressing constituents. "I got a call about some kind of disturbance at the diner." His gaze swept over the assembled Iron Angels without recognition, at first dismissing them as irrelevant old men on outdated motorcycles. Then he spotted Colonel Thompson, and his face went rigid with shock, quickly masked by years of political conditioning. "Jack," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough, Nate," the colonel replied, the informality deliberate, calculated to strip away the mayor's authority like peeling paint from rotted wood. Nathaniel glanced at his son, noting the damp clothes and reddened wrist. "Declan, wait in the car." "But Dad." "Now." The command was absolute. Declan shot one final glare at Margaret before leaving his friends following close behind. The bell jingled with finality as the door closed behind them. The mayor gestured toward the back of the diner. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Frank nodded reluctantly. "My office." As the mayor and colonel disappeared into the back room, the tension in the diner began to dissipate like smoke after gunfire. The other Iron Angels spread out, some taking seats at the counter, others introducing themselves to Margaret with the kind of old-world courtesy that had gone out of fashion decades ago. One of them, a burly man with a full white beard, pointed to her drawing. "You've got talent, just like Tommy said." Margaret looked up in surprise. "Thomas talked about my drawing." The man nodded, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Jim was always showing us your artwork, bragging about how his wife was going to be a famous artist someday." He extended a massive hand. "Name's Patterson, Dale Patterson. Your husband and I served together at Chosen." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. She'd drawn for herself a private passion that helped her process the world. The idea that Thomas had been proud enough to share her work with his brothers touched something deep in her chest, a place that had been frozen since the accident. Another veteran approached, this one wearing a patch that identified him as a medic. "Your husband saved my life at Chosen," he said quietly. "Carried me 3 miles through snow after I took shrapnel in both legs." He tapped the armrest of Margaret's wheelchair gently. "Guess we've got something in common now, ma'am." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I guess we do." More veterans gathered around, each with a story about Thomas. Margaret listened, absorbing these new dimensions of the man she'd lost too soon. As they talked, she continued sketching, capturing their faces, their expressions, creating a visual record of this unexpected reunion. Lucas brought coffee for everyone, moving with the efficiency of someone used to serving groups. He paused beside Margaret, watching her draw. "You really are talented," he said quietly. "Thanks," Margaret replied, adding shading to the portrait she was working on. "I always wanted to be an artist, but after the accident, it became more than a dream. It became therapy." Lucas nodded in understanding. "After I came back from Afghanistan, I had nightmares. Drawing helped me too, though I'm nowhere near as good as you." Before Margaret could respond, the door to Frank's office opened, and the colonel emerged alone. His face was grim as he approached the group gathered around Margaret. "Where's the mayor?" Wildcat asked. "Taking a moment to collect himself," the colonel replied. He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Flynn, I'm afraid I have some disturbing news about your accident." Margaret set down her pencil, a sense of foreboding washing over her like cold water. "What about it?" The colonel pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with her, a sign of respect of equality. "The road where your accident occurred was built by Harrington Construction. According to documents we've obtained, they cut corners on materials, ignored safety regulations, and bribed inspectors to look the way. The guardrail that failed was improperly installed. It should have prevented your car from going down that embankment." Margaret felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. "Are you saying my accident wasn't an accident?" "I'm saying it was preventable," the colonel said gently but firmly. "And Nathaniel Harrington is directly responsible for the conditions that caused it." The implications washed over Margaret in waves. Her life in a wheelchair, the pain she'd endured, the independence she'd lost, all because of corruption and greed. She looked toward the office where the mayor remained hidden, and something hard crystallized in her chest. "Did he admit it?" she asked. The colonel nodded. "He did, and more. Your husband suspected something was wrong with the municipal contracts Harrington was receiving. He was asking questions, reviewing documents." Margaret's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. "You think that's why Thomas had that falling out with the mayor before he died?" "I think your husband was a threat to Harrington's operation," the colonel said carefully. "And while I can't prove it yet, I find the timing of his fatal accident suspicious." A cold shock ran through Margaret. She had never questioned the circumstances of Thomas's death. A rainy night, a slick road, a tragic accident. But now doubt crept in, like poison, infecting every memory, every assumption she'd held for 3 years. The door to Frank's office opened again and Mayor Harrington emerged. His face was ashen, the politician's mask cracked enough to show the fear beneath. He looked at the assembled veterans, at Margaret, then at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice barely audible. "Terrible mistakes." "Mistakes?" The word burst from Margaret with unexpected force. "You call ruining lives a mistake? You call murder a mistake?" The mayor flinched as if she'd struck him. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But they did," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I did. Thomas did. How many others?" "Mr. Mayor, how many other families are grieving because you wanted to save money on steel and concrete?" Nathaniel Harrington had no response to that. He straightened his tie, a reflexive gesture that seemed absurdly inadequate to the moment. "I need to speak with my lawyer," he said finally, "and my son." As he left the diner, the bell jingling with inappropriate cheerfulness, Margaret felt a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness. Learning the truth should have been cathartic, but instead, it had only opened new wounds, exposed new layers of pain. The colonel placed a hand on her shoulder. "This isn't over, Mrs. Flynn. We came here today because Wildcat called, but we're staying because justice hasn't been served. The Iron Angels take care of our own, and Tommy Flynn was one of our own, which makes you family too." Margaret looked up at him, then at the circle of veterans surrounding her. Men who had fought in wars, who had seen the worst of humanity, now standing ready to fight for her. And beyond them, Lucas and Frank, allies in an unexpected battle. "What happens now?" she asked. The colonel's weathered face creased into a determined smile. "Now we do what the Iron Angels have always done. We ride together against the storm." The motorcycles gleamed in the parking lot, their engines silent but ready. Margaret wheeled herself to the window, looking at them not as symbols of rebellion, but as instruments of justice. In her mind, she could almost see Thomas among them, leather jacket on his shoulders, the wind in his hair. For the first time since her accident, Margaret felt something beyond acceptance or resignation. She felt purpose, and as the morning sun climbed higher in the Pennsylvania sky, she knew that her life was about to change once again. 24 hours later, Margaret sat in the Iron Angels clubhouse on the outskirts of Millbrook. The converted warehouse looked unremarkable from outside, but within its brick walls was a sanctuary of brotherhood and memory. The main room was large, with exposed beams overhead, and concrete floors softened by worn rugs. Vintage motorcycles lined one wall, each one pristine, each with a small plaque naming its owner in military service. Photographs covered another wall, hundreds of them, telling the story of the Iron Angels across 7 decades. Colonel Thompson stood near a large wooden table at the center of the room, deep in conversation with several other veterans. He looked up as Margaret entered, his stern face softening slightly. "Mrs. Flynn," he acknowledged, crossing the room to greet her. "Thank you for coming." Margaret wheeled herself further inside, taking in the memorabilia and military honors displayed throughout the space. "This isn't what I expected." The colonel smiled. "People often have misconceptions about motorcycle clubs. The media portrays us as outlaws and troublemakers. The reality is more complex." He guided her toward the wall of photographs, pointing to an image of young men in military uniforms standing beside early model motorcycles. The Iron Angels began in 1954, founded by Korean War veterans who found civilian life challenging. Back then, the country understood World War II soldiers, but Korea was the forgotten war. Many returned to find no parades, no recognition, precious little support. Margaret studied the photograph, recognizing a much younger wildcat among the men. "Why motorcycles?" "Freedom," the colonel said simply. "After the regimented life of the military and the confines of frozen foxholes, there's something liberating about the open road. The brotherhood we had in combat we found again in riding together." He moved down the wall, stopping at another photograph. This one showed a larger group in the late 1960s, and there in the center stood Thomas Flynn. He looked young and vital, his arm thrown around Wildcat's shoulders, both wearing the Iron Angels leather jackets. "Your husband joined in 1967, shortly after returning from his first tour as an advisor," the colonel explained. "He found in us what many veterans seek: understanding without explanation. Civilians mean well, but they can't comprehend what we've seen, what we've done." The colonel tapped the photo gently. "But Tommy understood, and we understood him." Margaret stared at the image of her husband, so different from the man she'd married. "I never knew any of this. Why didn't he tell me?" "Eleanor had her reasons, I'm sure," the colonel said, then caught himself. "I apologize. I meant to say you had your reasons for not asking." Margaret shook her head. "No, you were right the first time. Thomas's mother didn't approve of the club, thought it was beneath him. I think he kept it quiet to avoid family conflict." The colonel guided her wheelchair toward the central table where several other veterans had gathered. "Tommy stepped back from active membership when you married. Wanted to be the husband you deserved, but he never formally left. Once an Iron Angel, always an Iron Angel." The men around the table stood as Margaret approached. She recognized some from the diner, but others were new faces, all bearing the unmistakable mark of age and experience. The colonel introduced them one by one. Major Reynolds, Air Force and Korea, Sergeant Williams, Army, Lebanon, each with his rank and service history. The list continued, a living chronology of American military engagements spanning half a century. "And this," the colonel said, indicating a woman in her late 50s who had just entered from a side room, "is Dr. Catherine Brennan, former Army nurse and one of our most valued members." Doc Brennan had silver streaks through her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much suffering, but her eyes remained sharp and assessing. She stepped forward, extending a hand to Margaret. "Your husband spoke of you often," she said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of the upper Midwest. "He was very proud of your determination." Margaret shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "You're not what I expected to find in a motorcycle club." Doc smiled. "I had to fight twice as hard for my place here. First as a woman in the military medical corps, then as a female rider in a predominantly male world." She pulled up a chair beside Margaret. "But like you, I refuse to let others define my limitations." Colonel Thompson cleared his throat, bringing the group's attention to the matter at hand. "For those who weren't at the diner yesterday, we learned some disturbing information about Mrs. Flynn's accident and potentially about her husband's death." He laid out the facts, methodically explaining Nathaniel Harrington's confession about the substandard materials used in road construction. As he spoke, Margaret noticed Wildcat quietly entering the room, taking a position near the back, his face grim. "What we know," the colonel continued, "is that Harrington Construction has been cutting corners on municipal projects for years. What we suspect, but cannot yet prove, is that Thomas Flynn discovered this before his death." Margaret leaned forward in her wheelchair. "Do you think Mayor Harrington had Thomas killed?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The colonel chose his words carefully. "We have no direct evidence of that. What we do have is a pattern of suspicious accidents involving people who crossed Nathaniel Harrington. 3 in the last decade, all ruled accidental, all convenient for his business interests. And now we have his son terrorizing Tommy's widow, Wildcat added from the back of the room. That's no coincidence. Margaret felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. The car crash that took Thomas had always seemed like cruel fate. Now it looked increasingly like something more sinister. "What do you plan to do?" she asked. The colonel exchanged glances with the other veterans before responding. "We're going to expose Nathaniel Harrington's corruption and bring him to justice through legal channels. We may be bikers, but we're not vigilantes. We respect the law even when others don't." He spread several folders on the table, opening them to reveal documents, photographs, and what appeared to be financial records. "We've been gathering evidence for months. One of our members works in the county records office. Another is a retired building inspector. They've documented dozens of violations, bribes, cover-ups." Margaret looked through the nearest folder, recognizing the location of her accident in some of the photographs. Seeing the mangled guardrail that had failed to protect her car sent a shiver down her spine. "What's missing," the colonel continued, "is a compelling witness, someone who can put a human face to these crimes. That's where you come in if you're willing." Margaret closed the folder, looking up at the circle of veterans surrounding her. "You want me to testify against the most powerful man in Millbrook?" Doc Brennan placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Only if you choose to. We understand the risks involved." Margaret thought about her life since the accident. The pain, the surgeries, the abandoned dreams, the nights spent crying when no one could see, the frustration of adapting to a world not designed for wheelchairs, all because Nathaniel Harrington had valued profit over safety. "I'll do it," she said firmly, "but I want to understand everything first. No more secrets, no more half-truths." The colonel nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "Then let's begin with what we know about your husband's investigation." For the next hour, the Iron Angels laid out their case piece by painstaking piece. They showed Margaret municipal contracts with inflated costs, inspection reports, with forged signatures, bank records showing suspicious deposits to local officials. Throughout their presentation, Margaret took notes and made quick sketches, her artist's eye capturing details that might otherwise be missed. The veterans spoke with military precision, each contributing pieces to a puzzle that revealed systematic corruption reaching deep into Millbrook's government. The clubhouse door opened, admitting Lucas Turner with a paper bag that emitted the enticing aroma of food. "Thought you all might be hungry," he said, setting the bag on a side table. "Frank sent these over from the diner." Colonel Thompson introduced Lucas to those who hadn't met him, explaining his connection to Thomas Flynn. "Lucas served under your husband during basic training at Fort Benning. He's offered to help with our investigation." Lucas nodded to Margaret. "I owe your husband everything, ma'am. He saw potential in me when others didn't." As they ate the sandwiches Lucas had brought, the conversation turned to strategy. How to present their evidence, which authorities to approach, how to protect Margaret from retaliation. The veterans spoke with the precision of men accustomed to planning operations, considering contingencies and fallback positions. Margaret watched them work, impressed by their methodical approach. These were not hot-headed vigilantes, but disciplined strategists applying military precision to a civilian problem. A sudden commotion outside interrupted the discussion. The distinctive sound of a car engine revving aggressively, then tires squealing on pavement. Colonel Thompson moved to the window with surprising speed for a man his age. "Harrington's boy," he reported grimly, "and he's not alone." Margaret wheeled herself to another window. Outside, Declan's Camaro sat idling in the parking lot, headlights illuminating the row of parked motorcycles. Beside it was a police cruiser, its light bar flashing but siren silent. "Sheriff Morris," Wildcat growled, "Harrington's lapdog." They watched as Declan emerged from his car, pointing animatedly at the clubhouse while talking to the sheriff. Even from a distance, his body language conveyed angry determination. "What's he doing here?" Margaret asked. "Looking for trouble," the colonel replied, "and hoping to intimidate us with his father's influence." The sheriff nodded to Declan, then approached the clubhouse door alone, his hand resting casually on his holster. The doorbell rang, its ordinary sound incongruous with the tension of the moment. Colonel Thompson moved to answer it, signaling the others to stay back. "Be civil," he advised, "but record everything." Doc Brennan discreetly positioned herself near Margaret, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Lucas took up a position near the door, his stance relaxed but ready. The colonel opened the door, revealing Sheriff Morris, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a florid face and suspicious eyes. "Evening, Sheriff. What brings you to our establishment?" The sheriff peered past him, scanning the room until his gaze settled on Margaret. "Got a complaint about a disturbance at Maplewood Diner this morning. Witness says your club members were harassing the mayor's son." "That's interesting." the colonel replied mildly. Because we have multiple witnesses who saw the exact opposite. The mayor's son assaulting a disabled woman, destroying property, making threats. Sheriff Morris's expression didn't change. Well, now, that's not what I heard. And seeing as the lady in question is here with you, I'd say that supports the harassment claim. Margaret wheeled herself forward despite Doc's restraining hand. I'm here voluntarily, Sheriff. These men helped me when Declan Harrington attacked me unprovoked. There are at least a dozen witnesses who can confirm that. The sheriff regarded her with thinly veiled contempt. Miss, I understand you've had a hard time since your accident, but making false accusations against the mayor's son isn't going to help your situation. The colonel's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. Are you threatening this woman, Sheriff? Just stating facts, Thompson. Nobody likes troublemakers in Millbrook. The sheriff's hand still rested on his holster, a subtle reminder of his authority. Now I'm going to need statements from everyone who was at the diner this morning. Of course, the colonel agreed easily. We'll all be happy to provide sworn notarized statements. I assume you'll be collecting the same from all witnesses, including Frank Calloway and his staff. The sheriff frowned clearly, not expecting cooperation. That won't be necessary. Just tell your people to stay away from Declan Harrington. The mayor is quite concerned about this harassment. Wildcat stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of barely controlled anger. Funny how the mayor finds time to worry about his son being embarrassed, but not about the people injured by his company's negligence. Sheriff Morris's eyes narrowed. Careful, Cooper. Slander is a serious charge. So is criminal negligence, Wildcat retorted. And evidence doesn't lie, even when officials do. The tension in the room was palpable. Margaret could feel the veterans around her coiling like springs, decades of military discipline holding back their anger. Even Lucas, the youngest among them, had assumed the watchful stillness of a predator. The sheriff sensed the shift in atmosphere and took a step back toward the door. You folks want to be careful about making accusations you can't back up. This is a small town with a long memory. Indeed it is, the colonel agreed, his voice deceptively pleasant. And we've been remembering things for a very long time. Sheriff, unless you have an actual warrant or legitimate police business, I believe we're done here. Sheriff Morris hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. We'll be watching you. All of you. His gaze lingered on Margaret before he turned and left. Through the window, they watched as he returned to his cruiser, speaking briefly with Declan, before both vehicles departed, tires spitting gravel in their wake. That went well, Doc Brennan said dryly once they were gone. The colonel closed and locked the door. About as expected, Nathaniel's using his influence to try to intimidate us. It won't work, Wildcat declared, though his confident tone didn't quite reach his eyes. We've faced worse than corrupt small-town officials. Margaret looked around at the veterans, seeing the concern behind their determined expressions. I've put you all at risk, haven't I? The colonel shook his head firmly. We chose this fight long before you arrived, Mrs. Flynn. Your husband started asking questions about Harrington construction years ago. We're simply continuing his work. Lucas, who had remained silent during the sheriff's visit, finally spoke. They'll be watching the clubhouse now, and probably Margaret's home too. The implications settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Margaret thought of her modest house on Elm Street, the garden she could no longer tend, the neighbors who waved but never quite met her eyes anymore. I need to be careful, she said quietly. You need protection, the colonel corrected. He turned to Doc Brennan. Can you arrange for someone to stay with Mrs. Flynn? Already planned, Doc replied. Williams and Patterson will take shifts watching her house. Margaret started to protest, but the colonel raised his hand. This isn't negotiable, ma'am. Nathaniel Harrington is a dangerous man when cornered. We're not taking chances with your safety. The evening wore on, the Iron Angels continuing their planning while Margaret listened and occasionally contributed. These men had transformed from strangers to allies in the space of a day, united by loyalty to a man they'd lost but never forgotten. As darkness fell outside, Margaret felt exhaustion settling into her bones. The emotional weight of the day, the revelations about Thomas, the confrontations with the Harringtons, all of it pressed down on her like physical weight. You should rest, Doc Brennan said, noticing her fatigue. We have a room prepared if you'd like to stay here tonight. Margaret nodded gratefully. The idea of returning to her empty house, knowing it was being watched, filled her with a weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. Doc led her to a small room at the back of the clubhouse. Simple but clean, with a bed positioned for easy transfer from the wheelchair and an attached bathroom modified for accessibility. We made these changes last month, Doc explained, said we needed a medical recovery location. Now I know what I was really preparing for. After Doc left, Margaret sat alone in the quiet room. Through the thin walls, she could hear the low murmur of voices as the Iron Angels continued their war council. Planning, strategizing, preparing to take on an enemy who controlled the machinery of local power. She thought about Thomas, wondered what he would think of all this. Would he be proud of her determination? Worried about the risks she was taking? Both, probably. That had always been his way, supporting her choices while fretting about the consequences. Margaret reached for her sketchbook, needing the comfort of familiar motion, the scratch of pencil on paper. She began to draw from memory. Not the accident, not the guardrail, but Thomas as she'd seen him in that photograph from the clubhouse. Young and strong and surrounded by brothers who would decades later fight for his widow. She was still drawing when sleep finally claimed her, the pencil slipping from her fingers as exhaustion won its inevitable victory. And in her dreams, she heard the sound of motorcycle engines, a distant thunder that promised storms to come. Margaret woke to voices raised in urgent conversation. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. This wasn't her bedroom. The walls were unfamiliar, the ceiling too high, the sounds all wrong. Then memory returned like cold water. The Iron Angels clubhouse. The safe room Doc Brennan had prepared. The gathering storm that had become her life. She checked her watch. 3 in the morning. Whatever had woken the men in the main room was serious enough to ignore the needs of sleep. Using the modified bathroom and dressing, quickly Margaret wheeled herself toward the voices. The main room was lit by a single overhead lamp, casting long shadows across the faces of Colonel Thompson, Wildcat Cooper, and Lucas Turner. They stood around the central table studying what appeared to be photographs spread across its surface. Mrs. Flynn, the colonel acknowledged as she approached. "I apologize for the noise. We didn't mean to wake you." "What's happened?" Margaret asked, noting the grim set of their expressions. Wildcat picked up one of the photographs and handed it to her. The image showed her house on Elm Street, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The angle was high, probably from a second-story window of the house directly opposite. In the photograph, Margaret could see herself through her living room window, clearly visible, clearly vulnerable. "Williams found this pushed under the clubhouse door 20 minutes ago," the colonel explained. "Along with this." He handed her a note. The paper was cheap, the kind found in any office supply store. The message was typed impersonal, threatening in its very banality. "Stop asking questions. Accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business. You have until Monday." Monday. 2 days away. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down the note. "They were watching my house, taking pictures." "More than that," Lucas said quietly. He pointed to another photograph, this one showing Margaret's son Garrett in military uniform standing outside what appeared to be a military installation. The background architecture was distinctive Middle Eastern. This was taken recently, within the last week based on the date stamp. The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. They weren't just threatening her, they were threatening Garrett. Her son serving his country half a world away, now at risk because his mother had dared to seek justice. "How did they get this?" she whispered. "Military installations have civilian contractors," the colonel said. "Security personnel, maintenance workers, support staff. Some of them can be bought, and Nathaniel Harrington has money and connections." Margaret stared at the photograph of her son. 45 years old, a decorated Army major, career soldier, following in his father's footsteps. He'd inherited Thomas's sense of duty, his unshakable belief that service to country mattered more than personal comfort. And now that service had made him a target. "I need to call him," Margaret said, and warned him. "Respectfully, ma'am, that's the worst thing you could do right now," Lucas interjected. "If they are monitoring communications, and they almost certainly are, a panic call from you would confirm that their threat worked. It would also alert Garrett to danger he can't defend against from where he is." "So I do nothing." Margaret's voice rose despite her effort to control it. "I just let them threaten my son." "No," Colonel Thompson said firmly. "We protect him. I have contacts at CENTCOM. By morning, Garrett will have additional security he won't even notice. We take care of our own, Mrs. Flynn. That includes Tommy's son." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but sit helpless while invisible threats circled her child. But she recognized the truth in the colonel's words. Panic would accomplish nothing. Action, careful and calculated, was what the situation demanded. "What do we do?" she asked, forcing her voice to steadiness. Wildcat spoke up, his weathered face hard as stone. "We move up the timeline. The town council meeting is scheduled for Tuesday morning. We were planning to present our evidence, then do this properly publicly. But if Harrington's threatening Garrett, he's more desperate than we thought." "Desperate men make mistakes," the colonel observed. But there are also more dangerous. We need to force his hand before he can act on these threats. Lucas was already pulling out his phone. I'll contact Vivian Ashford. If we're going public early, we need media there to witness it. Who's Vivian Ashford? Margaret asked. Reporter for the Tribune, Wildcat explained. Investigative journalist, doesn't scare easy. Her grandfather was one of the original Iron Angels. She owes us, and more importantly, she's good at her job. The colonel studied the photographs again, his tactical mind working through scenarios and contingencies. We go tomorrow, Sunday morning. Council chambers, 9 a.m. We'll notify the media, the state police, everyone who needs to be there. Harrington won't be expecting it. Sunday morning, most of the town will be at church or sleeping off Saturday night. Perfect time for an ambush. An ambush, Margaret repeated. Military term, the colonel said with a slight smile, means catching the enemy when and where he least expects it. Nathaniel Harrington thinks he controls the timeline. We're going to prove him wrong. The next few hours passed in focused preparation. Lucas made calls waking people who owed favors or believed in justice or both. Wildcat reviewed their evidence, organizing it into a presentation that would be clear, compelling, irrefutable. Doc Brennan prepared a medical summary of Margaret's injuries, the long-term impacts, the life permanently altered by negligence. Margaret herself worked on her testimony, not reading from notes but speaking from the heart about what had been taken from her. Her independence, her mobility, her husband, her peace of mind. The simple act of walking into a room without planning the route, without checking for stairs, without wondering if doorways would accommodate her wheelchair. Dawn broke over Millbrook, Pennsylvania, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Margaret had been able to notice. But her mind was elsewhere, focused on the confrontation that lay ahead. By 8:30, a convoy had assembled at the Iron Angels clubhouse, 15 motorcycles' engines rumbling like controlled thunder. Lucas's truck with Margaret's wheelchair secured in the back. 2 additional vehicles carrying veterans who no longer rode but still showed up when brothers needed them. They rolled through Millbrook in formation, a parade of purpose that turned heads and stopped conversations. People standing outside churches in their Sunday best, families heading to breakfast, even the few police officers on duty. All stopped to watch the Iron Angels ride past. The town council chambers occupied the second floor of a brick building that had served as Millbrook's seat of government since 1923. Normally closed on Sundays, today its doors stood open. Inside, Vivian Ashford had already set up her recording equipment. A woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and sharper questions, she moved with the efficiency of someone who knew her craft. Mrs. Flynn, she said, extending her hand as Margaret entered. I'm honored to meet you. My grandfather spoke often about your husband, said Tommy Flynn was the bravest man he ever knew. Thank you, Margaret replied, shaking the offered hand. I'm learning that Thomas had a lot of lives I never knew about. The best men usually do, Vivian said gently. Then her professional demeanor returned. I've notified 3 other news outlets and the state police. They're sending representatives, should be here within the hour. I've also filed a preliminary story with my editor. If anything happens to any of us today, the full story goes public immediately. The colonel nodded approval. Good insurance policy. More people began arriving. State police investigators in plain clothes. Representatives from the Attorney General's office. Even Judge Maxwell Sterling, 78 years old and supposedly retired, but whose reputation for absolute integrity had survived 4 decades on the bench. Nathaniel Harrington arrived at 8:55, his face darkening as he took in the assembled crowd. He'd come expecting an empty building, a quiet Sunday to prepare for Tuesday's council meeting. Instead, he found his worst nightmare: witnesses, cameras, and the machinery of justice he'd spent 3 decades corrupting. What is this? He demanded, looking directly at Colonel Thompson. The council doesn't meet until Tuesday. This isn't a council meeting, Nate, the colonel replied. This is a reckoning. Declan Harrington entered behind his father, looking confused and hungover. He spotted Margaret, and his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Whatever he'd expected this Sunday morning, it wasn't this. Judge Sterling took a position at the front of the room, his presence lending official weight to the proceedings. This is an emergency citizens' assembly convened under Section 12 of the Pennsylvania Municipal Code. Mrs. Margaret Flynn has credible evidence of criminal activity that requires immediate public disclosure. Mayor Harrington, you're welcome to stay or leave, but these proceedings will continue regardless. Nathaniel Harrington's political instincts warred visibly with his survival instincts. Leaving would look like guilt. Staying meant facing accusations he'd spent years bearing. Finally, he took a seat in the front row, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the armrests with white-knuckle intensity. "Proceed," Judge Sterling said, nodding to Margaret. She wheeled herself to the front of the room, acutely aware of the cameras, the officials, the veterans who'd become her unlikely family. This was the moment everything changed, the point of no return. "My name is Margaret Flynn," she began, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "3 years ago, my husband Thomas died when his car left Highway 47 and crashed down an embankment. The official investigation ruled it an accident, driver error combined with wet roads." She paused, letting that sink in. "But my husband was the most careful driver I ever knew. 30 years without so much as a parking ticket. And Thomas didn't drink. Not a drop, not ever. Not since Korea, where he saw what alcohol did to good men in bad situations. Yet the toxicology report claimed he had a blood alcohol level of 0.15, more than drunk, legally impaired." Nathaniel Harrington started to rise. Judge Sterling gestured him back down. "You'll have your chance to speak, Mayor. Let the lady finish." Margaret continued. "1 year after Thomas died, I had my own accident. Same road, same curve, same guardrail that failed to stop my husband's car. Except this time I survived. Paralyzed from the waist down, but alive. Alive to ask questions. Alive to investigate. Alive to discover the truth." She pulled out the folder Colonel Thompson had shown her, holding it up for everyone to see. "This contains engineering specifications for Highway 47. The contract called for steel guardrails with posts driven 6 feet into the ground, spaced every 6 feet along curves. The actual installation used posts driven 3 feet deep, spaced every 10 feet. The steel itself was grade C when the contract specified grade A." A murmur ran through the assembled witnesses. Vivian Ashford's camera never wavered, capturing every moment. "The company that built Highway 47 was Harrington Construction," Margaret said, looking directly at the mayor. "The inspector who signed off on the work was Gerald Morris, the same Gerald Morris who's now sheriff. The same sheriff who responded to both my husband's accident and mine. The same sheriff who took 30 minutes to arrive despite being only 5 minutes away. Long enough for evidence to be compromised. Long enough for a toxicology report to be falsified." Nathaniel Harrington was on his feet now. "These are outrageous accusations. You have no proof of any of this." "I have the contract," Margaret replied calmly. "I have photographs of the actual installation. I have engineering analysis showing the guardrail couldn't have withstood impact from a vehicle traveling at legal speeds. And I have this." She nodded to Colonel Thompson, who stepped forward with a laptop. He connected it to the projection system Vivian had set up, and suddenly the room was watching Thomas Flynn on screen. Recorded 1 week before his death, sitting in his study looking directly at the camera with the calm determination of a man who knew he might not survive what he was about to do. "My name is Thomas Flynn," the recording began. "If you're watching this, I'm probably dead. And if I'm dead, it's because I discovered something Nathaniel Harrington couldn't let me share." The room had gone completely silent. Even Nathaniel Harrington seemed frozen, watching his past crimes projected on the wall like ghosts made visible. Thomas's recorded voice continued. "I've been investigating irregularities in municipal construction contracts for 6 months. What I've found is systematic fraud. Harrington Construction has been billing the town for grade A materials while using grade C. Billing for proper installation while cutting corners that compromise safety. The difference in cut has been going directly into Nathaniel Harrington's pocket. I estimate over $2 million in the last 5 years alone." The recording showed Thomas holding up documents, specifications, photographs, evidence meticulously gathered and preserved. 4 people have died on roads built by Harrington Construction in the last 3 years, Thomas said. "The official investigations all concluded accidental causes, but I believe those deaths were the direct result of negligent construction. I've contacted the state police. I'm meeting with investigators tomorrow. If anything happens to me before that meeting, know that it wasn't an accident. Know that Nathaniel Harrington is responsible." The recording ended. Silence filled the room like a held breath. Judge Sterling spoke first. "Mayor Harrington, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Nathaniel Harrington's face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray. His political mask had cracked completely, revealing the desperate man beneath. "That recording could be faked. Anyone can manipulate video these days." "It's not fake," Declan Harrington said quietly. Every head turned toward him. He stood slowly, his hands shaking, his face pale. "It's not fake because I found the original file on my father's computer, along with other files. Communications with Sheriff Morris about eliminating threats. Payment records to someone named Victor Kozlov. And this." He pulled a small object from his pocket. A woman's locket, silver, tarnished with age, and stained with something dark that might have been blood. Margaret gasped. She knew that locket. She'd given it to Thomas on their wedding day 40 years ago. He'd worn it every day since, kept it close to his heart. She'd wondered what happened to it after the accident. The hospital had said his personal effects were lost in the crash. "I found this in my father's safe," Declan said, his voice breaking, along with photographs of Thomas Flynn being followed, surveillance reports, and a final payment notation dated one day after Mr. Flynn died. He looked at his father with something like grief. "You killed him. You killed Thomas Flynn, and you kept his locket like some kind of trophy." Nathaniel Harrington lunged at his son, but Colonel Thompson stepped between them, a wall of controlled violence that the mayor couldn't breach. State police investigators were already moving, pulling Harrington back. Reading him his rights, the machinery of justice finally grinding into motion. The mayor's last words as they led him away were directed at Declan. "You've destroyed this family. Everything I built. Gone because you're weak." "No," Declan said quietly. "Gone because you're evil." The next hours passed in a blur of statements and documentation. The state police took Margaret's testimony. Declan's evidence, the Iron Angels gathered proof. Vivian Ashford filed story after story, her words painting a picture of corruption so deep it had poisoned an entire town. By noon, the story had gone national. Small-town mayor accused of murder to cover construction fraud, the kind of scandal that ended political careers and launched federal investigations. Margaret sat in the empty council chambers after everyone else had left, exhausted, but strangely at peace. Wildcat Cooper sat beside her, his weathered face reflecting similar fatigue. "Tommy would be proud," he said quietly. "You finished what he started." "We finished it," Margaret corrected. "The Iron Angels, you and the Colonel and all the others. I couldn't have done this alone." "Maybe not," Wildcat agreed. "But you had the courage to try, that's what mattered." The trial took 3 months to organize. Nathaniel Harrington facing charges of murder, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes. Sheriff Morris turned state's evidence to save himself, confirming everything Thomas had suspected and more. And Victor Kozlov, the hired killer, extradited from Canada, where he'd fled when the story broke. Margaret attended every day of the proceedings, wheeling herself into the courtroom with the same determination that had brought her this far. The Iron Angels filled the gallery, a silent wall of support. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Declan's testimony about finding his father's files, the engineering evidence showing systematic corner cutting, the financial records proving fraud, and most damning, the communications between Harrington and Kozlov discussing how to handle the Flynn problem. Thomas's recorded statement played in court exactly as it had that Sunday morning. The jury watched in rapt silence as a dead man accused his killer from beyond the grave. The defense tried, claimed the recording was manipulated, the evidence circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable. But truth has weight that lies cannot match. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Nathaniel Harrington received 30 years. At 58, it was effectively a life sentence. Morris got 15. And Victor Kozlov, the man who'd actually forced Thomas's car off the road, who'd falsified the toxicology report, who'd staged an accident to cover murder, received life without possibility of parole. 6 months after the trial, on a bright spring morning, Margaret stood at Thomas's grave in the National Cemetery. Stood, not sat. The surgery had been experimental, the recovery agonizing, but after 3 years in a wheelchair, Margaret Flynn had learned to walk again. Not perfectly, not without pain or a cane for support, but walk nonetheless. The Iron Angels had assembled behind her. 15 motorcycles arranged in a semicircle, their riders at attention, in worn leather vests bearing faded patches. Colonel Thompson held a flag folded with military precision. Wildcat Cooper carried a wreath of flowers. "Thomas Flynn," the colonel said, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "Soldier, brother, hero, you started a fight you didn't live to finish. But your widow finished it for you. Justice is served. Mission complete." The motorcycles started in sequence, their engines building to a thunder that rolled across the cemetery like a 21-gun salute rendered in chrome and gasoline. Margaret stood at her husband's grave, tears streaming down her face, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. 2 years later, the Thomas Flynn Justice Foundation occupied a modest office on Main Street, Millbrook. Margaret served as executive director, helping victims of negligent construction pursue legal action against corporations that valued profit over safety. Declan Harrington, having turned state's evidence and served 2 years of supervised probation, worked as her legal assistant, using his inside knowledge of his father's operations to identify patterns of fraud in other companies. The foundation had already won settlements for 7 families, forcing changes in building codes across Pennsylvania and 3 neighboring states. Lives saved by regulations written in the blood of those who died when safety was sacrificed for greed. Margaret stood at her office window, watching Millbrook go about its business. The town had changed in subtle ways. A new mayor elected on promises of transparency, a new sheriff who actually enforced the law, a new understanding that corruption once exposed found fewer shadows to hide in. Her phone rang. Garrett's number. She answered with a smile. "Hey, Mom." Her son's voice came through warm and familiar. "Just wanted to let you know I'm wheels down in Philly. Should be at your place by dinner time." "I'll make your favorite," Margaret promised. "Pot roast just like your father used to make." After hanging up, she returned to the window. Outside, she could see Wildcat Cooper parking his motorcycle, coming for their weekly meeting to review new cases. Could see Vivian Ashford walking toward the office with her recording equipment, doing a follow-up story on the foundation's success. Could see in the reflection of the glass a woman who'd been broken and rebuilt herself stronger, who'd lost everything and found purpose in the ashes, who'd taken her grief and rage and channeled them into something that mattered, something that helped others, something that honored the memory of a good man who died seeking truth. The Iron Angels had taught her that justice wasn't something handed down from on high. It was something you fought for, bled for, refused to surrender no matter how impossible the odds seemed. Thomas had fought that fight and paid with his life. Margaret had continued it and found her own redemption. She looked at the photograph on her desk. Thomas in his dress uniform, young and strong, and smiling with that slight sadness that never quite left the eyes of men who'd seen war. Beside it sat his Purple Heart, returned to her after being held as evidence during the trial. "We did it, Tommy," she whispered to the photograph. "We got them all. You can rest now." Outside, the spring sun climbed higher in a cloudless Pennsylvania sky. Somewhere in the distance, motorcycle engines rumbled. The Iron Angels riding together, watching over their own. Forever vigilant, forever loyal, forever bound by brotherhood forged in fire and tempered by time. And in her office on Main Street, Margaret Flynn smiled and got back to work. There were more cases to review, more families to help, more wrongs to right. The fight never truly ended, but that was okay. She'd learned from the best how to keep fighting, how to stand your ground, even when standing seemed impossible. Justice, she'd discovered, wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, and hers was far from over.